Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Okay, well, as everybody filters in, we will get started, just mindful of everybody's time. We're so thrilled you've joined us for the third session of the ONlit book study focused on the text, Teaching Skills for Complex Text by Dr. Heidi and Mesmer. And Leigh, if we could jump forward. We'd first like to start by acknowledging that ONLIT's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. If you are new to ONLIT, welcome. We are a joint project in partnership between Dyslexia Canada and the Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association, IDA Ontario, and our role is to support the implementation and the rollout of the revised language curriculum. And this project is funded through the Ontario Ministry of Education. We gratefully acknowledge their support that makes activities like this possible. We do note that the views expressed tonight are the views of ONLIT and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education. We are recording this series, so if you miss a week or if you're just joining us now and would like to catch up, welcome. All recordings are found in the ONLIT resource library. So if you go into the resource library, you can find this entry and it'll link right to the playlist. So anytime we add a new recording, it will automatically be updated there. So that's where you can go to find the recordings. And with that, Leigh, Nellie, I think I will pass it over to you. I know you've got a wonderful session planned, so on to you.
Thank you so much, Una. So before we begin, so first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us on this snowy night. Before we begin, we thought we would engage in a little retrieval practice. And so Nellie and I have come to realize the power of retrieval practice because Una often sort of not forces us, but forces us to retrieve the knowledge of how to set up and manage our own tech for these sessions. And we can now do it, so it works. Retrieval practice is the strategy of recalling facts or concepts from memory to enhance learning. It increases the likelihood that that information will enter into our long-term memory. And so we thought we would practice some retrieval practice using last session's information, anaphora. So we're going to ask you to read the big bolded paragraph or sentence and find the pronominal and substitution anaphora, please, and place those in the chat box. So Nellie and Leigh have been supporting educators in learning about helping their students read and understand complex text. They really enjoy working on this project. Wonderful. So I can see that people are recognizing that the they and the their. And this are the anaphora that we referred to last time. Thank you so much for engaging in that. So tonight we're going to be speaking about connectives in sentences. Our agenda is as follows. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about what is a connective anyway. We'll address why they matter, how we can teach them well, and then a wrap up. As always, we're using the wonderful Dr. Heidi and Mesmer text, Teaching Skills for Complex Text, deepening close reading in the classroom. And again, Nellie and I feel so fortunate to have had this opportunity because we ourselves are really enjoying digging into it and end up going down rabbit holes all the time because it's just so much great learning that leads to more great learning. We are in session 3 of 6. So to quote Bon Jovi, we're halfway there. So with that, what is a connective anyway? So a connective is a general term that refers to many different text elements. So we're going to focus tonight on 2 different types of connectives, with the first being a word that explicitly links 2 clauses. Remember that a clause is a group of words containing a noun or pronoun, which is the subject, and a verb, otherwise referred to as predicate. You can have an independent clause or a dependent clause. And remember that a dependent clause is a group of words that contain a subject and verb, but does not express a complete thought. Connectives can also be a sentence linker or a word that connects ideas into adjacent sentences. We always want to be able to see where this content lives in our new Ontario language curriculum document. And in the curriculum context, it does mention that we want students integrating components of word, sentence, and text level comprehension. As we saw last week, the expectation across grades in C1.1, using foundational knowledge and skills, is the main place where cohesive ties live. And during our last session, we learned about how an AFRA fits into this. And tonight we're going to be looking specifically at connectives. And a quick reminder that a cohesive device affects comprehension because it helps readers to integrate information between sentences in a text. And many students, even our skilled readers, never consciously actually think about the author's use of cohesive devices. And so it is up to us to explicitly teach, model, and use and to help students recognize the importance of these.
And so we also need to touch upon strand B, because as Leigh just mentioned, if we think back to C1.1 using those that foundational knowledge and skills to comprehend text, many of those are found in strand B, specifically under B3. So again, this means that there's a lot of overlap between the strands. Now, this is just a snapshot to remind us that the B3 continuum exists, and it expands on skills that students need to learn, specific to syntax, sentence structure, grammar, and conventions as a whole. And that, these are expectations that students are expected to learn and apply through oral communication, reading, and writing. And so they are laid out, the continuum is laid out across the grades in terms of initial development, consolidation, and then refinement. That's what the I, C, and R stand for in the columns. So I'm not sure how well you can all see this, but Una is actually going to, oh, she already did put a link in the chat to it in case anyone hasn't had the opportunity to see this in its PDF version. I find it's easier to look at this way. But this is, again, just a screenshot of one section of it. So you'll notice here, B3.2, this is grammar. The first point speaks about common conjunctions. And then if you go down to the bottom, the last two are highlighting coordinating and subordinating conjunctions, which are all types of connectives. So we are going to jump right in tonight. So before we go any further down this connectives road, we thought we'd have you do a connectives hunt, which is one of the activities mentioned at the end of the chapter. We have decided to rename what are formerly known as breakout rooms to something a little less intimidating. So please don't run off or drop off the call or disappear. We're going to have literacy lounge number 1. So if you can think of a lounge, it's a little more relaxed. You can participate if you choose. You can be a silent observer. Of course, we hope you participate, but we understand. So no stress zone. And we can go ahead and, yeah, thanks, Leigh.
And I think, Nellie, it is Literacy Lounge 1, but I think there is only one, right? I don't think we have a second one.
Yes, you're absolutely, okay, so another reason not to be scared
Absolutely.
off. There's only one. There's only
Yes.
one. You're right. Originally, we had planned 2. So what's going to happen is you will choose a passage to read, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And in those passages, you're going to be looking for examples of connectives and thinking about how the use of that connective in the text could pose a barrier to comprehension, or what we'd need to be aware of as educators when planning instruction for that particular text. So this is an example of what the chart is going to look like that you are going to work with if you choose to. The example here is made up. It's not actually from one of the texts, but you can refer back to page 38 in the book if you do have a copy with you. And on page 38, there is a handy chart. It's figure 2.1, which really lays out different types of connectives. If when you are looking at the passages, you happen to stumble upon examples of anaphora, that would be fantastic to include as well. So here in the chart, we basically just laid out 3 columns. You can plop the example in the left-hand column, what type of connective it is. Is it linking clauses within the same sentence, or is it connecting 2 sentences together? And then what pops up in terms of something that might be a potential barrier to comprehension with that specific sentence or that group of sentences. So here are the two options we chose for this evening. Fluency in perspective, because we realized that we had some tech issues with the links last time, and people were not able to actually access this one in the breakout room. So we had to actually remove the link. So we thought we would include it again. Our apologies for that in the last session. The other publication is a publication from Les Plans, which is an educational services company, if you're not familiar with it, that creates publications really to help students learn and think critically about current events. So this one is the Canadian Reader, which is one of their publications, and they do offer some free downloads. It's available in English and in French, and again, it's really to help kids understand nonfiction or informational text. So in a moment, the link will go into the chat, and what we'd ask you to do is please click on it to open the document before moving to your designated literacy lounge. And when you open that document, everything you need will be in there. So from that document that has now been put in the chat, you'll be able to pick a text and then fill out the corresponding chart. So Una was going to create some relaxing literacy lounges for us for this evening. So I wish we could serve coffee and tea, but and we were hoping to put approximately eight or so people per lounge.
Great.
How
long? Oops, sorry. How long would you like them to be for?
Leigh, what are you thinking? About 8 minutes or so?
Yeah, and if people are finished, then they can come back and join us, and we'll know that it's time to close the lounge for the evening.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Nellie, Leigh, if you're good, I will open these up.
Sounds
good. We're great.
Okay. You're all set, Leigh. Or Nellie.
Oh, it's me. Yeah, great.
I knew you were set.
Actually, Leigh, can we go back to that slide?
Absolutely. If I can figure out how, there we go.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for your participation in that. We just thought we'd offer you an opportunity to take a moment to plop anything at all in the chat. Could be something you noticed, could be something about the resource specifically, about the activity, or of course, an example of a connective that you caught in one of the passages. So we'll just
unmute. I mean, we could offer the chance.
Absolutely. Just give a moment there.
Can I just share? We were doing the Canadian Reader Orca example, and we found lots of examples of anaphora, if I'm saying that correctly. But we didn't find that many connectives actually, and like the sentences were really quite simple. The only one that we kind of found was, I think it was "in spite of this." And it was more like a phrase than just a word. So we had a big discussion about that.
I see somebody else, Lisa's mentioned that as well, that there is maybe more anaphora in that one. We did see one under the image, I believe. Is that right, Nellie?
Yeah, we did. At the very bottom under the image, there's a sentence. The sentence reads, "They are also transient orcas because they are frequently on the move." And there was a but in there. They tried herding her with boats, but nothing worked. And there was a couple of ands, which are
there were lots of ands.
Obvious. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Thanks, Mel. Annie.
Thank you. Great. And I see other folks putting things in, and it is overwhelming. You're quite right, Laura. So you can see where that piece of really, constructing a sentence to sort of highlight this is really helpful at the beginning. And that's a great takeaway for us, that it's a lot of text to try to find a needle in a haystack, maybe.
Absolutely. Challenging and some sneaky bets I see there. Thanks, Rebecca. Okay, I think that's great. Do you want to move on, Leigh?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for participating in that. And that's some great takeaways for us as educators as well. So now we're going to take a quick peek at why connectives matter. So not all connectives are created equal, just like with an aphora, some are harder than others to grasp, understand, and use. This work can be done orally and actually should be done orally. And it was a great opportunity for us to learn a new word because there was orally AU in this text. And of course, that's auditory, the listening. And we just sort of broadened this to include oral acquisition, listening to people speak and engaging in the talk. So oral acquisition, there is a sort of a sequence that we want to follow, starting with additive example. That would be and, temporal, so you hear that time, a word such as before, causative, because, and oppositional, although. So those are all examples of those types of connectives. And of course, this idea goes back to what James Britton said and pointed out in 1970, that our literacy and language float on a sea of talk. And so doing this work orally really is the basis for being able to recognize and understand connectives in text, but also be able to apply them in our writing. In the text, Dr. Mesmer highlights some of the research that's been done in this area. Payne and colleagues found that while intermediate students typically have a good understanding and command of additive connectives, so for example, and, they are still developing an understanding of temporal, causative, and adversative or oppositional connectives. And while the focus of this chapter is on explicit connectives where the relationship is directly stated, sometimes connectives are also implicit, and that means that they've been removed and the reader has to infer that connection. And that can be really hard. In fact, textbook developers in the 1970s removed connectives to lower the readability level. And this is even more challenging, than just having them removed, especially if background knowledge is lacking. So for example, this is one that I came up with because of recent weather around the planet. Iguanas are falling from the trees in Florida. The temperature is lower than usual for this time of year. And so if students don't have any knowledge about that, and there isn't an explicit connective given, that can be incredibly hard to sort of build that understanding.
And Leigh, I just wanted to pop in,
Yeah.
actually, you made me think of something, a clarification that I needed as well, and some other educators may not be aware of, that when in the United States, when they're referring to intermediate level or intermediate grades or intermediate learners, they're actually referring to grades 3 to 6, I believe, correct? Not our typical grade 7 and 8, what we would consider to be intermediate students.
Right. Thank you, Nellie. I often forget that too. It's hard to keep track of different grades and divisions throughout the world. So connectives are pivotal words that must be understood in order to infer the author's meaning. And Dr. Heidi and Mesmer does say that on page 25. If students don't understand the role that one little word plays, the main idea of a sentence might not be understood. Connectives help readers to see how ideas and clauses and sentences are related or connected, hence the name Connectives. Very few, if any, professional resource materials exist on how to address and teach connectives, and yet the evidence suggests that about 1/3 of all sentences that students encounter in complex text will contain them. Historically, we may have had an overemphasis on the subject predicate and maybe not enough attention paid to the meaning that is signaled by a connective, and that can obviously impact comprehension. If we think back to the article that we introduced in the first week, No More Strategy of the Week, we can see that this is an example of using that strategy of inferring happening in the context of learning about connectives, rather than just teaching inferring for the sake of inferring. You could see that it would allow that teaching and use of inferring to happen throughout the year in different contexts.
Okay, so having touched a bit upon the what and the why of connectives, we would like to shift now to that practical piece. So how can we at least begin to teach this in an explicit manner in our classrooms, a manner that will, of course, support close reading of complex text or grade level text, which is the overall focus of why we've come together to dig into this book. So our next 3 slides are 3 key takeaways that Dr. Mesmer touches upon in the chapter as 3 things to kind of keep in the back of our mind as we teach connectives. So the first takeaway is defining connectives is important, but we can't stop there. So we know that, defining them is essential, especially for our multilingual learners, but knowing, their definitions and then being able to use them, of course, are two different things. So we have to teach what the connective means, and then also remember to be giving lots and lots of examples and reword sentences to help explain. It makes me think of Anita Archer every time she says, that we shouldn't be making any assumptions. And of course, this reminds us of the importance of retrieval. So once a connective is introduced or defined, we need to keep going, keep coming back to it. And this is, of course, that underlying message of multiple opportunities, just like we would do with something, with skills in math. Okay, so our second takeaway, in line with this notion of explanation being essential, we can't understate the value of thinking aloud and really making our thinking visible or audible for our students. So when we do that, they have access to that inner dialogue that is helping us make decisions. And it also supports them in developing their own inner speech, is what Dr. Mesmer calls it. And they're developing this as they're reading, and they're identifying connectives, and those think alouds provided by us really help model for them what that thinking can sound like. There's a great example of this on page 27 of the chapter. And then finally, an idea that keeps popping up and coming back because it really does bear repeating. Of course, the type of connective and relationship will impact how difficult it will be to understand it, but we cannot forget the key role that background knowledge plays. And we know that limited background knowledge about the topic of the text can also impact, how hard it is to understand the connective that's being used in that instance.
Nellie, I think that's such a great place to pop in. I don't know if you've said this in the past, but I always talked about let's activate our background knowledge. And it is so important to recognize that sometimes we're asking students to activate something that might not be there. And so we might need to fill in that knowledge piece. I cringe when I think about the times what I would have said, we're going to activate our background knowledge when the students had nothing on that topic.
Used to all the time. Absolutely. I can relate to that. So again, in thinking about this how piece, something else to keep in mind is that it's helpful to zero in on those connectives that are going to give us the most bang for buck. So what we've done here is pull from chart or figure 2.1. And these are also mentioned at the bottom of page 25. These are the particular connectives that were bolded in that chart because they frequently occur in grade 6 social studies materials. So what Dr. Mesmer says is that, teaching these will really help build capacity for comprehension. They are common in content area text. So you may not want to begin with these necessarily, but helpful to know that these are the ones that you would really want to focus on and teach. In addition to that, and also on the bottom of page 25, there is a sharing of information about grade 4 to 6 materials that were analyzed. And there's a list of other connectives which were found to occur frequently. Some of those are the fanboys. So for, and, but, so, yet, and I probably missed one. Or
I think you might have got them all. Yeah.
And then we've already mentioned that distinction about intermediate grades referring to grades 3 to 6 in the United States.
So in the text, Dr. Mesmer lays out a roadmap for teaching a unit on connectives that can be used over a 3 to 4 week period, and it follows a suggested sequence. And this can be found on starting on page 28. Of course, we always want to keep our students in mind, their age, their first language, and their overall language experiences, and tweak for our learners, and of course, the context and content area. And as Dr. Tim Shanahan reminds us, we want to use texts that are worth teaching and reading. Each week, the instruction focuses on a different set of connectives and builds to a culminating week where the students are asked to apply what they've learned. And so it really is that nice scaffolding, a well thought out plan in terms of delivering this content with lots of opportunities to practice. And we'll see in a moment why that's important. So the learning goals for this time would include the ability to understand sentences with connectives in multiple positions. And we're going to experience a little bit of that about how we can move around where these words occur in a sentence. We would want students to be able to identify clauses, and of course that means they would need to know what a clause is and sentences that are being connected. We would want students to be able to identify connectives in reading and writing, and of course that is a big piece of this, being able to apply it in writing and describe their role and how they work. We would want students to be able to use the connectives by generalizing to authentic text, so their own reading of text independently and writing. And finally, be able to create multiple sentences that demonstrate flexible use of connectives. Oop, I'm going to back that up because I meant to say something else there. Fundamentally, learning about connectives supports connecting and comprehending sentences. And earlier, when we looked at the curriculum, we saw that our instruction must support students integrating components of word, sentence, and text level comprehension. And so what we're looking at tonight is that sentence level comprehension. However, as you can imagine, it's funny, as I used however, I'm like, ooh, a connective. As you can imagine, text level comprehension relies heavily on understanding sentences. And this sentence instruction is not solely about understanding connectives, but also providing students with the ability to use and analyze them. It really is, it's a complex thing. It's a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of one thing relies on something else. And so we thought that this would be the perfect time to introduce something called the instructional hierarchy. Maybe you've heard about it before, maybe you haven't. If you haven't, you certainly will, I'm sure, in the future. The instructional hierarchy is a model of skill acquisition, and this hierarchy has been researched for decades. When we learn something new, we move through a series of predictable stages, and this applies to anything that we learn. So from playing an instrument to math skills to the formation of letters to decoding. I mean, it really is all things that we learn and then are asked to apply and use. And it's important for us to be aware of the instructional hierarchy, since we are most effective when our instruction, our teaching, matches where the students are in that hierarchy. The hierarchy begins with the acquisition stage. And at this stage, students are slow and inaccurate as they have limited knowledge of the target skill or concept. Instructional strategies that support are the most useful to increase accuracy include explicit and systematic instruction. And we've talked a lot about that tonight. And it includes immediate feedback and opportunities for guided practice, thinking about that I do, we do, you do. So really focusing on that guidance. In the fluency stage, students are now accurate with the target skill, but they can be slow and are not yet automatic. They require opportunities to practice the skill and build accurate and fast, but not like, fast not being the goal, just meaning that it's reflective of it being accurate and automatic. Instructional strategies that are most useful to facilitate fluency include purposeful and varied practice opportunities, feedback, the setting of goals, and performance-based reinforcements. In the generalization stage, students apply and practice this fluency in new contexts and settings. Instructional strategies that promote generalization and include providing a range of tasks and activities with a variety of difficulties of level difficulties, providing cues for generalization, and slowly fading out our support. In adaptation, students can perform the skill across settings with accuracy and proficiency. Instructional strategies that we can utilize facilitate adaptation, including presenting new tasks that use the previous knowledge, think alouds, performance feedback, and on the skill application. And once we have acquisition, once we have fluency, then students are able to generalize and adapt the skill. Dr. Mesmer highlights 3 steps for introducing each of the connective types. She points out that there are many ways to do this, but that following a simple 3-step sequence of direct instruction is useful. Direct instruction, and we did have some conversation, Nellie and I, about the terms direct instruction, explicit instruction, and even direct instruction has different uses and it means different things. But in this case, we're referring to the instruction that emphasizes well-developed and carefully planned lessons designed around small learning increments, so just small pieces of information at a time. And Dr. Mesmer provides a script that you might even follow. In the first step, we would model one connective in a constructed sentence. On page 30, this is done using the Connectives bookmark that you can find on page 41 and the temporal connective after, so temporal meaning time. The next step would have us provide another constructed sentence for the students to analyze in pairs, where they would have to identify the connective, the parts of the sentence being joined or combined, and then explain to their partner the meaning of the sentence. And finally, the whole class would debrief, or the whole group would debrief, as facilitated and led by us, discussing the work. And so it is a simple, predictable 3-step sequence. Oh,
there we go.
there.
Yep, got it. Thank you. So at the end of the chapter, there are many great practical activities that are shared, but we've chosen to focus in on one of these in particular, sentence combining. And Dr. Mesmer does explain this in more detail than the other activities at the end of the chapter. So here we go. Sentence combining is a technique for smoothing out choppy writing by varying sentence structure and making a piece of writing more engaging for the reader. And this comes from a Reading Rockets article, and Una is actually going to pop the link in the chat in case you're interested. Gives a nice overview about sentence combining, what it is, and why it's a great idea to try it out. And sentence combining practice really helps writers to manipulate syntax by rewriting these little short kernel sentences, which is, if we think about it, not unlike what skilled writers do as they go through the writing process. And at this point, you might be thinking, I thought this book study was all about close reading of complex text, but of course we know, and I think Leigh mentioned this earlier, that we can't separate reading from writing, right? And so teaching skills in reading also transfer to, we want to be thinking about having those skills transfer to writing. Okay, so Bruce, we're going to just jump into a bit of the why of sentence combining. And so Bruce Sadler has done a lot of work on sentence combining, and he actually, there's an entire book that is excellent if you're interested in learning more, as well as an article that he wrote. And again, that's another link that we're going to be popping into the chat. Thank you. Which, the article is a great summary of what sentence combining is. It goes into a little more detail. And so these points come from his book, which Dr. Mesmer does reference in this section of the chapter. So, sentence combining as a practice is especially, helpful for all students, but especially helpful for those who struggle. And we know that our students who struggle even more sometimes with writing, especially when we're thinking about planning, organizing, elaborating, revising in a meaningful way to make improvements to their work. And they often have a negative self-image about themselves as writers. Sentence combining helps to clarify and, tighten up thoughts around that skill of revision and show students, how and why to revise their writing. Better syntax equals better writing. How, syntax, thinking about how words are arranged to convey meaning. And of course, we know that that's not separate from the use of connectives. There is evidence that it may improve reading fluency and reading comprehension. Supports the use of punctuation when reading and when writing. So we all have students, we've all listened to students read who just skip right over the punctuation, are having difficulty using that punctuation to guide meaning. We know also that punctuation, the correct use of punctuation, is tied to use of connectives in sentences. And finally, it's a way to teach grammar and syntax without using all of that terminology that can sometimes be confusing. So it creates opportunities to teach grammar and punctuation and syntax in a meaningful context. So thinking again about that B3 continuum. So it really helps students improve their writing while at the same time learning the meaning of connectives and how they work. And hopefully you'll see it's a rich strategy that taps really a broad range of skills. So again, just like there's an entire book, there could be an entire webinar or more on this practice of combining sentences, and there are many ways to do it, but we've decided to keep it simple and in line with what is outlined in the chapter. So our focus is on using conjunctions or connectives to do this. On page 33, Dr. Mesmer outlines that our starting point, the best starting point, is with cued exercises. With a regular or high frequency connective. So this is the most straightforward way where we merge two simple sentences into a compound sentence using a connector word. So here's an example. The plant did not survive. The plant did not get watered. And of course, we have that conjunction or connective because in brackets after the second sentence. And we want to explain to students that the word in brackets is important information that needs to be included in the combination. You might consider, and Dr. Mesmer also has a few examples of this in the chapter, sharing your thinking aloud as you do this. And if you bear with me, it might sound something like this. The first sentence tells me the plant died. The second sentence tells me it didn't receive any water. I know that I'm supposed to use the conjunction because to combine both of these small sentences into one. I know that because means one thing caused another. And what I also know, because of what I've learned in science, is that plants need water to survive. So I can make an inference here that the plant died without the water. I think I'll use the first part followed by the word because, and then the second part, which will mean that the dead plant happened because of the no water. I could even replace the words the plant with a pronoun it in the second part so that my sentence is less repetitive. And here we have the plant did not survive because the plant or it did not get watered. And part of that thinking aloud could also, as I just mentioned, prompt the students to notice how we can make a pronominal substitution to avoid repeating the words the plant. And therefore, we're working with anaphora as well. So this example doesn't have too many options in terms of ways that we can combine it, which really allows for, a mindful systematic practice that can help students to work with one structure at a time, and then we can scaffold bit by bit. But as Leigh mentioned a few slides back, we want to keep in mind that the connective doesn't always have to occur in the middle, much like this next example, which is going to pop up on the screen any second if our animation worked.
I think it's there.
Oh, it is there. It was my mistake. So because the plant did not get watered, or because the plant did not get watered, the plant or it did not survive. So just a few things to keep in mind, students usually need many, many models, thinking about that gradual release of responsibility. And then of course they could work with a partner and eventually later on create their own sentences using a specific target connective. They could also practice combining the same sentences with different connectives and then just, having a class discussion about how the meaning changes every time. Another thing that's mentioned in the chapter is the possibility of doing this on sentence strips, but just a caution that often when you're using sentence strips, when the sentences become combined, that may affect punctuation or capitalization. And just a couple of other things. So here we used science content just to think about how to get the most out of this practice. And of course, we would want to ensure comprehension of the vocabulary and background knowledge first. So we may also want to start with sentences about familiar everyday topics and then extend to content areas once students understand the task demands and they're comfortable with it. So again, just being mindful of the need for modeling, discussion, and guided practice, because that's really what's going to help lead the students towards internalizing these strategies and begin to use them, when they're revising their own writing. Also important to give the opportunity to share the sentences and discuss the ways that they changed and ways that revisions can be made to improve quality of writing when we're talking about extending this and applying it in the context of writing.
And I think, Nellie, over the years, as we do this work, we'll build up a great bank of sentences that we can use to do this work. And I'm sure that I don't need to point out to many of you, but ChatGPT does an incredible job of providing examples. And if you're not happy with the one that's provided, you can always say reword, and it will continue to list examples. And then you just have this wonderful bank of these sentences that you can use for this work. Okay. So I'm going to take a moment now and talk about or look at open or uncued connectives. So after students have learned most of the connectives, they can be taught to creatively and flexibly combine sentences using their knowledge of these. And if we think back to that instructional hierarchy, it's, they've had that acquisition, they've had the opportunity to practice to build fluency, and now we're really in the generalization adaptation stages. And this step is really important because it's what allows students to demonstrate that they have fully understand connectives. So for uncued or open connectives, we provide students with 2 simple sentences and ask them to combine them in different ways. And we want to ensure students ensure that students have had a lot of practice before trying these open exercises. And we want to consider providing a tool such as a connective bookmark on page 41. We don't provide a keyword, and as such, there are many combinations possible. And you can already see and imagine that this would be more complex for students. Students have to be able to decide and think critically about what important information in the sentences needs to be included when they are both combined. And so here's an example using everyday familiar vocabulary. Oh, we'll give it an example of that, Julie. We can work through it together. And so Nellie and I often talk about the prompts that we use and then often do ask it to reword, and we might tweak it. So we can try a bit of that at the end. Let's do that. Nellie, can you help remind me? Okay. So 2 simple, sentences using everyday vocabulary. However, of course, I couldn't decide if I should say vase or vase. The vase fell. No, I think I usually say vase. The vase fell. The vase was small. The most obvious, of course, would be that the vase fell and the vase was small. You can see that there would be, as Nellie said with the last one, lots of opportunities for rich discussion, justification of solutions, ordering, word choices, etc. So for example, the vase fell and it was small. The vase fell because it was small. The vase was small, so it fell. We can start with 2 sentences, but of course we can even build to include 3 or more, and even more complex and more challenging and requiring feedback, discussion, all those important pieces to ensure that students are on the right track in the moment, so they aren't practicing something incorrectly.
So let's give it a go. Thanks, Leigh. We're going to try this out together, not in the literacy lounge. We're all just going to stay together and give this a go. We are hoping, I'm just checking the time, to do 2 practices. We may only have a chance to do 1. The first one has 2 sentences, and then the second practice has 3. And we're only going to use the chat to interact. So just click in here.
Sorry, are you asking me to click?
Yeah, could we click?
Sorry about that.
Okay, perfect. And I'm going to ask Una to actually also plop that in the chat. So here we have practice number 1. I live in an urban community. I can walk to a grocery store. So this is uncued, and it comes from grade 3 social studies curriculum. So what we'd like you to try and do, if you're willing, is just go ahead and put in the chat possible ways that you could connect these 2 sentences. So we'll just give you a moment to play around with that. Oh, I see a therefore. Because. I see one flipped around. I can walk to a grocery store because I live in an urban community. Since I live in an urban community, I can walk to a grocery store.
And I live in an urban community where I can walk to a grocery store.
This is awesome. Perfect. Okay, I think we should just try number 2 then.
Oh, that's me. Sorry. I
Yep.
got all carried looking and reading.
That's okay. So, okay, so we may not need to put this in the chat because we're all together and we can see it on the screen. Practice number 2, we live in a rural community. The grocery store is far from my home. We drive to the grocery store. So maybe we can give that one a go. It's a little more complicated, 3 sentences, and combining it into one.
Oh, I like the last example too, as I live in an urban community. Mm-hmm.
Because we live in a rural community, the grocery store is far from my home, so we drive to the grocery store.
Oh, and then to it.
We drive, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
See a substitution anaphora in the future there.
You know, there's just so many
this
possibilities. It shows that it takes practice, it takes knowledge, and there are many possibilities.
And you could see how the value and the power of this being used with students in terms of both reading comprehension and improving quality of writing.
Mm-hmm. And building content knowledge.
Exactly. And I'll just add before we move on, just a couple of additional tips. So there are a bank of sample kernel sentences at the back, quite a bank actually at the back of the chapter that you can kind of use to get this going. You can also use familiar stories for practice. Another great idea is to repurpose all of those leveled readers, taking earlier leveled readers that often have, 2 or 3 short kernel sentences, one after the other, giving those to students and having them practice using them for sentence combining. And then just to keep sessions really short and lively, that perky pace that Anita Archer always talks about. And I think we'll move on.
Well, believe it or not, we're going to be now thinking about wrapping up. This time passes so quickly, and we're getting better at the timing, which is super exciting. And we thought we would wrap up with an activity that some of you may have heard of called But Because So, or Because But So. I've heard it in both ways. And this comes from Judith Hochman's But Because So sentence expansion. It is quite a fabulous way of checking students' knowledge, getting them to practice these skills. And it's quite neat because I know, Nellie, you and I have both used it in French as well. And so it really is applicable for content areas to practice skills, to build knowledge, to assess what kids know. So we can't rave about this one highly enough. So in a moment, Una is going to pop something in the chat, and we're going to ask you to take this sentence stem, and we're going to ask you to complete it using either but or because or so. So let's see if I can show. I think that we've got that animated. So Una's going to give us this sentence stem. Starting with oral work when teaching connectives is important, and you will complete it with because, or you can complete it with starting with oral work when teaching connectives is important, but, and then lastly, starting with oral work when teaching connectives is important, so. So if you can just give that a moment and think about how you would like to complete that using but, because, or so. I love that rehearsal, the low risk, the safety is so important. Oh, yay, writing.
So see you talk.
I get so excited. Talked about the importance of a practice, that fluency building practice. Oh,
lots of because.
But it can be time consuming. Yeah.
But it is also important for students to practice applying it in their writing too. Exactly. Wonder if we have any so's. But we need to connect to print.
Oh, let's do.
So let's all do it tomorrow.
Oh, it's a snow day here. I will not be doing it tomorrow. Like, we're actually closed snow day. So we do need to plan for it, purposely plan. Yes. Well, I could just sit here and look at these forever. I mean, they're wonderful.
And I was just going to add that we can do this in any content area. I've done it in math, and it just so rich.
And I think about, the risk taking isn't just for our students, it's about us, right? Because we won't get this wrong, or pardon me, we won't get this right all the time. And we need to give our permission to spend time on it and to learn and to make mistakes, because very few of us, if any, were taught how to teach this. And so the risk taking isn't just about our students, it's about us and having grace with ourselves.
1,000%. And thanks to Beth for saying that. We need to give
Mhm.
ourselves permission to spend time on it. Yeah. Okay.
And so with that, we're going to finish with a quote. When students learn connectives, they possess a powerful insight about these pivotal words that will support close reading and more sophisticated writing. This lack of understanding of connectives can hinder student understanding of texts. It is often most visible in their writing. We see evidence of this in writing on a pretty regular basis. Connectives are key for text comprehension because they guide inferences between propositions and texts and make explicit the logical relation between ideas, generate cohesion, and that idea of coherence in texts. Our next session is February 26th. We're going to be looking at paragraphs. So understanding paragraphs, the first step from main idea and summarizing. And that's a big one. You can see that based on the size of the chapter as well.
And actually, sorry, go ahead, Leigh.
Oh, you go ahead, Nellie.
I was just going to say, because I did see someone mention this book in the chat, and I wanted to say it is an excellent resource, Syntax Knowledge to Practice, by Margie Gillis and Nancy Eberhardt. It really makes what can feel like a super overwhelming thing to teach syntax. It really breaks it down for us as educators in a super easy, manageable, accessible, and I would say not that intimidating way. So I don't remember who it was that mentioned it, but I have it right here. So I thought I would just kind of get a visual.
And that's a great place to talk about some of the webinars that she has done for Heidi and ONlit. So those, I believe, are available. Is that right, Una, in various channels?
Margie has done some great work for ONlit, focused on syntax, so that's all available. And the other book that got some love in the chat was the Bruce Sadler Sentence Combining, A Teacher's Guide to Effective Sentence Writing. Yes, which is also wonderful. A really good read.
Thank you all so much.